Welcome to the summit. You are the web of life. And I can now introduce you to Claire Willis. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And you are a clinical social worker and you help people at the end of their lives and with people who have grief. You have support groups and your books are about that. And so you're also an author, and you're also a co-founder of the Boston nonprofit Facing Cancer Together. And I have your book here that I've read, and it's absolutely beautiful, Opening to Grief. And it's also with your co-writer, Marnie Crawford Samuelson. And it's a handbook, a companion. It's beautiful how you really go into depth with grief, like what to do when you're grieving. What you often feel alone and lost, and here you can get some help, some support in the way that, okay, grief is a natural process. It's something that we all experience in life. It's part of life, and you can be with it, you can let it happen and not push it away or resist it, because there's something in kind of being with it. Something happens where the love holds it, you could say. But I'll let you speak about that, actually. So please.
It's interesting that you would use this word resist, because there's a little saying that what we resist will persist. And this book is an invitation to be with grief and allow grief to work in you so that you can be more present both to yourself and to other people. After we published the book, we found a wonderful description of grief that I wish I had found before we published the book, because we would have put it right in there. And I want to read it because I'm going to frame my words today using the words of an author named Jamie Anderson. And she writes this about grief. She says, "Grief, I have learned, is really just love. All that unspent love gathers up in the corners of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and in that hollow part of your chest. Grief is just love with no place to go." So if we think about grief as love, it's not something we want to resist. It's our expression of having loved someone or something that we've lost. And our capacity to be with our own grief shapes our capacity to be with other people who are grieving. And one of the things that I hear a lot in my work is when someone dies, people will say, the people I thought would be there for me disappeared, and people came forward I never imagined. And I try to explain to people that those are people that are comfortable with their own grief. So in allowing our grief or inviting our grief in, and being with it, we deepen our relationship to ourselves, and we deepen our capacity to be with others who are grieving, because we can't be with others if we can't be with that part of ourselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. That if you know it yourself, then you can be there for other people. It's like that space is open.
That's right.
Yeah. Because when you grieve, there's so much going on. It seems like all these very strong emotions, like, for example, anger or depression or despair or anxiety or just feeling completely lost and like almost like life is not worth living anymore. It's just sad, it's all these heavy.
I'm glad you're saying this, because I think one of the myths about grief is that grief expresses itself through sadness and sorrow or despair or hopelessness. But grief is commonly irritability, it's impatience, it can look like anger or rage, and it can also look like gratitude and relief. Grief is It's like, I think of it as an umbrella word that holds a variety of feelings underneath it, many of which people don't recognize as grief. And one of the things that happens in families a lot is that people grieve differently. And it's not unusual for me to hear someone say, no one in my family is grieving the loss of my mother. I'm the only one. And I usually say, I'm sure they're grieving her, but you're not recognizing the form in which it comes. And grief can come in the form of denial. I don't want to deal with it. You know, it's so we don't escape grief. We just have as many different expressions of grief as there are people who are grieving.
So it doesn't look a certain way. It's grieving can be expressed in so many different ways.
Yeah. There was a great article in the Boston Globe several years ago, written by a woman named Joan Wickersham, who's done some writing on suicide. And she talks about being at a party. And she meets a woman whose husband died 4 years ago. And she says, every time this woman meets somebody at the party, she mentions her husband. And then there's a man at the party who has remarried within a year, his wife's best friend, after she died. And Joan says, both of these are expressions of grief. And I love that because they're the two opposite spectrums of it, that we just each handle and encounter grief differently.
Yeah. So it's like it happens naturally for each one of us. And it's a matter of allowing however it expresses, however it happens to us. It's about allowing whatever that is.
Well, yes and no. Because often what happens is our sorrow and our loss gets truncated by rage and anger. And what happens is when someone does their grief with rage and anger, it gives them a false sense of agency and strength. And I don't even know what another word would be. But when we allow ourselves to feel heartbreak, there's a sense of vulnerability and there's a sense of helplessness that we can allow. And that actually requires someone who's strong enough to allow those feelings. If you think about our politics and a politician that recently held office in our country, he was always angry about one thing or another. And I used to listen to him and think, what happened to him as a child that he thinks he has to be so tough? And I think that kind of facade, while it's one way of being with grief, it's probably not going to be a healing way to be with grief, because there's something deeper that you're not touching into. But anger and impatience and irritability are common expressions of grief.
Okay, yeah, I can, now when you say it, it's like, it makes sense. But you wouldn't think that otherwise. You would just think,
That's right.
So
they're not grieving.
Yeah.
And a lot of, so often in family work, I hear people feel that they're alone in their grief because people aren't expressing it the way they are, which is sad because it just makes the grief journey more lonely.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's always nice to be seen and heard. I mean, it always is, no matter if you have sorrow or joy. It's just always nice to be seen and heard by other people, kind of sharing that love and
having people attune to each other, be in synchrony with each other, you know?
Yeah.
But then you feel less alone. And I think one of the things I would just say about the book, as long as we're saying that, is that many of the people that endorsed the book said that they described it as a companion. And that was like the biggest compliment Marnie and I could get, that it was a companion, because we really wanted people to read the book and feel less lonely. And that seems to come out because people know when they read the book that we've walked the talk, that we've been the journey, and we know it from the inside out, which is nice, you know, that we're not just writing it from our heads.
Right. Yeah, because your whole life experience,
right,
as a clinical worker for what, 20 years, and it is, you have so much life experience being with people that are grieving.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And
people that are dying too. I mean, that's also people who are grieving the loss of their life.
Yeah.
People who are grieving someone they lost, and some people who are grieving the loss of their own life. Both.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is a big loss to lose your life, obviously. I mean, so how do you grieve that?
Well, I think more to the point is how do I hold being with someone who's dying? I have a group I do with one of my teachers for people who are dying. And there's people in the group who have stage 4 cancer, and there are people that have ALS. And ironically enough, this group holds more joy than any group I lead, because grief and gratitude are really closely linked. And when death is on the horizon and it's not just an abstract concept, you have your gratitude for what is deepens exponentially. You're so grateful for the smallest things. So there's a lot of joy that goes hand in hand, and gratitude that go hand in hand with grief. And one of the things that we stress in the group is, well, we stress a lot of things, but one of the things we stress is, with whatever time you have left, how can we be really intentional about using it in a way that's going to sustain you in the journey? And the other way I think about it a lot is, what legacy do you want to leave, and who do you want to leave it to, and how can we create a form for that? So we do a lot of legacy work together, but a lot of it is about being present. I mean, this group is really sweet with each other because they're all in this boat together, and they know their time is limited. And it's like a little community of devoted people to each other. The love in the room is just palpable. It's very sweet. It's very sweet.
Yeah. And you also wrote a book about that, right? The end of life. And
I wrote a book called Lasting Words, A Guide to Finding Meaning Toward the Close of Life. And what I did was I researched common issues that come up for people when they know they're going to die. And each chapter is devoted to one of those issues. So one of them is creating a life review and leaving a record of things that are important to you, to people you love. Another chapter is on gratitude. To whom do you want to thank? And there's a chapter on forgiveness. Whom do you need to forgive? And make what apologies need to be made before you close your life. And one of the more poignant chapters in the book is one on how do we convey the wisdom we've accrued in our life to those we love. And I lead people through a process of looking at lessons they've learned through suffering, for the most part, and then what do they want to share from the lessons they've learned with those they love, and sharing both the story of how they learned it and as well as the wisdom that emerged from it.
yeah.
So I use that a lot in my work with people who are dying.
Yeah. Yeah. And then for the people who are left behind, there's the grieving, and then you work with them as well.
I do. I work with people who are dying and the people who are left behind in the face of loss. Yes, because our culture really doesn't sanction grief. We give people 3 or 4 days off from work, and a lot of people just don't understand how debilitating and how difficult grief can be, because we tend to expect people to return to work and function like they did before. And that's just not the way it works. There's a lot of models of grief out there, and our book debunks some of them, because grief doesn't go away. It changes in intensity and frequency and duration, but it doesn't ever go away if you love somebody, and it shouldn't go away, but it becomes much more bearable. And we find ways to integrate it into our life and carry it forward in meaningful ways, carrying forward the person that we loved and the qualities that they left us with, that we loved about them. So if we think of grief as an expression of love, We don't want it to go away. We want to find a way to carry that love with us for those we've loved and lost.
Yeah. And that sounds really beautiful, what you're saying. It is like, it's being, that love is being lived through us somehow.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Although it's heartbreaking at the same time.
It's, oh, yes, not to gloss over this in any way. I mean, I think one of the analogies that I really love is that grief is a little bit like a broken bone. You break a bone and the pain is searing. It's so searing. And then maybe you have an operation, maybe you have a cast, and then you have some PT, and then you walk again on the broken bone. But on rainy days, the bone will always ache. And I think of grief as being like that you're always going to have a dull ache that appears periodically around a loss, but it will not be the searing pain that takes over everything in your house when it first happens. As time goes on, there'll be a gray chair that remains in your living room that you visited when you need, solace, or you need to connect with the person. But it never completely goes away, but it does change and it becomes much more bearable.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I want to just say for your listeners that's important is that when somebody dies, they call in the literature, they call this a primary loss. So the person you love died. But often when that person dies, there are multiple losses that go along with it that are actually called secondary losses, but they're not secondary in impact. And I really want to stress that. They actually can sometimes be more primary than the loss of the person. So, for instance, in my bereavement group recently, a woman said to me, more than missing my partner, what I miss is being part of a couple. So some of the other common secondary losses that occur for people are things like there's a change often in economic stability. Some people have to change their homes. People who have caregiven someone over a period of time are losing a job and a focus and a mission in their life. So in a way, they've lost a part-time job. You may have lost a co-parent. You may have lost a co-grandparent. You may have had your faith shattered in some way because this death happened in ways it shouldn't have happened. So there's a lot, and certainly the friendships change. Your friendships invariably will change in the face of a loss. And these losses can be as painful and sometimes more painful than the death of the person. And we don't often name them. And it's important to name that there are peripheral losses that accompany the loss or death of a person that are very important to name and consider and identify.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems like a lot too, right? There's so many losses at the same time.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. But people often don't identify them as losses. They think, but their grief is layered with these losses. So one of the things that I always do is say to people, what are some of the secondary losses that are occurring? And it's very helpful because it helps them understand why they feel so terrible, why they feel badly about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, because there may be a lot of regrets too, and guilt and shame coming up as well.
Yes. Well, there's a lot of shame in our culture, and especially around certain types of losses. So there's a lot of losses in our culture that aren't sanctioned, that they're not acknowledged in any common cultural way. So for instance, the loss of a pet can be devastating to somebody, especially someone who doesn't have children, and even people who have children. And you don't ever read about gatherings to acknowledge the loss of a pet. It's a very lonely grief. And then you've got a lot of what they call in the literature ambiguous grief. And you have the grief of miscarriages or stillborns, or the grief of abortions. You have the grief of infertility. You have the grief of aging parents who have dementia and diminishing capacities. You have the grief of retirement, even though you may want to be retiring. There's so many griefs that are unnamed in our culture. People who have disabilities, or people who lose a limb in an athletic event. Their life is never the same. Even the diagnosis of cancer brings a huge grief, whether you're going to be okay again or not, because there's a loss of innocence. A sore throat is never a sore throat again. It's a possible recurrence. So there's a loss of innocence about how life should unfold. So there's many losses that don't get named or acknowledged in our society, which are really make the grief process much harder.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like allowing the grief and allowing others to help you too. And like open heart somehow. Like if you close your heart, it kind of puts everything on a distance. But if you open hearted, it's like maybe the grieving will happen faster, or it's almost like there's more space for it to happen.
Well, there's more space to let it shape you and change you, because if you lose somebody you love, you're really never the same again. That's not to say your life is worse or better, but you're different. We've just been through something. We've just been through a cultural grief, or actually we're still going through it. The grief, the losses that were generated by COVID. We can emerge from this as if nothing happened, or we can take what we've been through and let it shape our lives into a more meaningful way going forward. We really shouldn't return to life as it was, because we learned a lot during this time that we shouldn't forget.
Mm. Yeah, so it's like all that happens in life, it shapes you, it changes, it transforms. It's
You will let it.
Yeah.
I think in one of the things in Buddhism that they talk about is how can you be intimate with what happens? Because just to go back to what we said at the beginning, is what we resist will persist. So if we don't grieve, I think one of the things that actually happened during COVID is that, David Brooks writes something really beautiful. He talked about that there was a river of woe flowing through our culture. And I love the analogy of river, because water touches into everything. And this COVID, which is a pandemic of a virus, but it was a pandemic of fear, and it was a pandemic of grief, touched all of us in some ways or another, some of us more than others. But the other thing it did was it resurrected and opened up old losses from our life that we may not have previously grieved. And whatever you don't grieve will come back. And it will come back in some way that you don't recognize. You may find yourself more volatile. You may find yourself carrying anger and irritability and resentment and not really know why. So the book is an invitation to grieve, and to allow, each chapter is a resource for helping the reader hold grief and be with their grief, so that grief can open you into a more loving person, more in touch with yourself, and more in touch with people around you.
Yeah. And it's like it becomes more intimate. It's almost like you're letting life come close, or you are life.
Yes, exactly. Letting life come closer. That's right, exactly. Letting life come closer as it is, and not how we want it to be.
Yeah.
And none of us ask for loss, but we're going to experience loss whether we want to or not. And then what do we do with that? How do we let it change us? How do we let it connect ourselves to other people? How do we let it bring us to do work in the world that lessens suffering?
Yeah, like being there for one another. Yeah. And it is part of life. It just is, right? It's gain and loss, and it's just inevitable.
But I think holding it as grief as an expression of love with no place to go gives us, I think, more permission to hold grief and be with it and to grieve, as if we can remember that it's an expression of our loving.
Yeah. And in your book, you also have different references to all kind of websites and other books to read and to help you go through the grieving.
Yes, the book has, the first section of the book is chapters about how to help you hold grief. The second chapter is questions that people frequently ask about grief. And there's also a section in there on practices that will help you hold grief and be with your grief, spiritual practices that are ancient and tried and true. And then there's a section on inspiring poetry and books and websites to help you hold grief too. So it's a resource as well as a companion.
Yeah. Oh, wow, Claire, this is so beautiful. Thank you so much for being here and for your book. And what's your website so people can get in touch with you?
My website is openingtogrief.com. And feel free to get in touch with me if you'd like to, and I will answer your email.
Yeah, and you can write more books too, right? Because
I don't know about that, but I think this was my last book, my second and my last.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm glad you did write it, because it's very and it's also, it's not like it takes you weeks to read it, it's accessible, and it's a good companion book. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.